Hello, and welcome to For Your Information, the Cutchogue New Suffolk Free Library podcast. I'm your host, Emma Layden, Emerging Technologies Librarian here at the Cutchogue New Suffolk Free Library. Thanks for joining us. Today, we're joined by local journalist and author Steve Wick to discuss his nonfiction book, All That Remains. All That Remains details the lives of several men and women who lived and worked on a farm labor camp in Cutchogue, one of the last of its kind. It grew out of reporting Steve did for Newsday between 2005 and 2008, with photos by Viorel Florescu. The book was published in collaboration with the Cutchogue New Suffolk Free Library. Our local history librarian, Mariella Ostrowski, was very involved in that, as I understand.
Absolutely.
In 2024. Steve, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm really glad to be doing this.
Yeah.
I think this is very cool.
Yeah, I think so too. I'm excited. So just to give people like the sense of what the book is about and what it covers, in the early 2000s, you interviewed people living and working at a farm labor camp on Depot Lane in Cutchogue. So I'd like to start with, if we could, the very opening of the book. Could you describe how you discovered the Depot Lane labor camp and the people who lived there?
I actually found out about it in about the mid-1990s. I was working on a book called Heaven and Earth, The Last Farmers of the North Fork, which was published about 1996, I think. And I was very much inspired, Emma, by Peter Matheson, the writer on the South Fork, a major nonfiction and a novelist as well. Had a wonderful book called Men's Lives about the last Bayman community, essentially in East Hampton, where they once thrived. The changes in the town were kind of depleting them, and they were dying out. And Peter wrote a wonderful book called Men's Lives about that last colony of fishermen and Baymen who all had their roots back in very early East Hampton history. And interestingly enough, spoke a kind of Elizabethan dialect. And I was really moved by his book, which also contained a lot of photographs. A very wealthy woman in East Hampton hired almost a dozen photographers to kind of chronicle, like a documentary, the lives of these people, hence Men's Lives. When I read that book, I thought, wow, I mean, isn't there something comparable on the North Fork? Because the last of the potato farmers by the mid-90s were beginning to fade away. So in doing the research for Heaven and Earth in the mid-90s, I heard about that camp. Now, mind you, I live in Cutchogue and probably drove by it 100 times. But one of the farmers, a Mattituck potato farmer, said, you really should go over there and meet people, particularly a man named Jimmy Wilson, who's kind of the crew boss there. So I put that sort of aside. I finished the book, Heaven and Earth, The Last Farmers of the North Fork. And then a few years later, in the early 2000s, someone told me that was literally the last of its last camp. So I began to visit that camp again and got to know everybody there. At that time, there was probably 6 or 8 Black men and women, all Southern born, living there. And I realized that they were the end of something that had been on the North Fork for generations. As potato farming faded away, for economic reasons, and vineyards came in to sort of take their place. The idea of Southern-born Black men and women, farm workers, putting potatoes in bags ended up dying away. So I spent 3 or 4 years just watching them and then wrote a whole series of stories for Newsday. And as I've told Mariella this before, I got really attached to those people and their lives. Jimmy Wilson was in his 80s, born in Southern Georgia. Frank Singleton was probably in his 60s, although he had no idea how old he was. He didn't even know where he was from. He had so lost contact with anyone of his roots, of his family. I found out later where he was from, and we can talk about how I ended up taking him home. There was an Oliver Burke there who was a little bit younger. I would say he was in his late 50s. He wasn't entirely certain when he was born, but he'd been in that camp, since he'd been in camps basically since he was a child, either in New Jersey, on Eastern Long Island, and then in this last camp on Depot Lane in Cutchogue. And one of the days I was in there with Viorel, the photographer, the Newsday photographer, Oliver came up to me and said, can you help me? And I said, yeah, what's going on? He said, I don't have a birth certificate. And I said, wow, you don't have a birth certificate. Where do you think you're from? And he said, well, I know I was born in Georgia. And I think my mother's name, Ida May. But other than that, I don't know anything. So that really got me started to write a lot of stories about that camp and to document their lives. And in documenting their lives, it also told the story of this place, Cutchogue in the North Fork. There were once these camps virtually at every railroad crossing from Calverton to Orient. There was even a camp on Shelter Island. There were camps in Bridgehampton, which was once a huge potato growing area. There were camps in Sagaponack, but they were all gone. They were gone in the South Fork long before the last one was gone here. So I ended up writing about them. And at some point during that writing for Newsday, the stories for Newsday, the big barn that they worked in and graded potatoes, meaning the potatoes were brought in by just 3 potato farmers. That's all essentially that was left. They would wash them and put them in bags and grade them by size. The barn burned down, and that was it. There was no place else to go. So to me, the story then changed, Emma. It became, well, what do you do if you don't know where you're from? What do you do if you don't even know how old you are or any family members' names? Now the only thing you've ever done since basically childhood is gone. And that ended up being kind of the driving energy of the Newsday story. And then it was Mariella and her friend Jan Nicholson at a Side by Side Foundation who thought they could turn this into a book.
We do know whenabouts they came out, these migrant labor camps where they would start busing specifically Black farmers up from the South to work on them. This is like a post-World War II phenomenon.
I think there was some before then, but certainly by the end of the war, when Long Island had probably 50, 60, 70,000 acres of potatoes from what's now Levittown all the way to the east, these camps sprung in. There was another really notorious camp on Cox Lane in Cutchogue that closed in the 60s. And that was all people from Arkansas. And the crew boss, the people that were in charge of the camp, he would go out to rural Arkansas and just put people on buses. And he'd make them big promises about you'll have a wonderful place to live, a wonderful place to eat your dinners. The food will be great. The pay's great. All of it was essentially a bunch of lies. And that camp ended up having a fire that killed, I think, 4 men from Arkansas. Or maybe one of them might have been from North Carolina. But these camps were notorious. And if you go back in time to old-time police officials, like police officials in Riverhead, where there were duck labor camps all over the creeks in Riverhead. For example, the Indian Island Country Club was once a very big duck farm. Okay. And the conditions in those camps were even worse. I mean, people slept in abandoned buses and shacks. But for me, all that story boiled down to this one place and this one group. And my goal was to try to tell their stories.
Reading through it and reading how these people were so isolated and the people not even knowing
that they were there.
The fact, as I told you, I grew up in Cutchogue. And for me, I understand, like, I have a very privileged upbringing in many ways. And as a kid or even as an adolescent, I had no idea. I thought of the North Fork as being kind of a bubble, like almost away from the rest of the outside world. And I was a kid, but I was living here, when that Depot Lane camp was still operating. So I guess just for me, reading this as someone who grew up around here and lives around here now, just how isolated these people were and how much, like, even a local, in a very small town, had no idea any of this was
they were very isolated. They were a group that just stayed there in that barn and in the camp. Now, if you go up Depot Lane now, the camp they lived in is actually still there. The barn's long gone, burned down. But the little cinder block building that they lived in, And I remember when I first got really interested in it, I was actually coming out of King Cullen or going into King Cullen. And it was a very rainy day. And I saw this extremely gaunt, skinny black man trying to navigate grocery bags on a bicycle. I thought, where is this guy from? And I went in and got what I needed, and I came out and he was gone. And I went out looking for him. And then I drove up Depot Lane, and there he was. He's passing the Catholic church there. And he turned around went over the railroad tracks, turned around the big barn, and went into that camp. And I thought, wow, I didn't even know there was a camp there. I had seen some black people around the area, but around that particular area on Depot Lane, but you never saw them in town other than maybe, King Cullen or the liquor store or something. And the next morning I went back and I knocked on the door, and Jimmy Wilson, who was then in his 80s, answered the door. And I remember he kind of looked at me like I was from Mars or something, like, what are you doing here? And it was very clear to me that they had never been visited by the health department. They'd never been visited by any town official. Had a health department official gone in that camp, they would have shut it down. Had a town official or a Department of Labor official gone in and said, well, can you show me your employment records? Are you paying people? They would have shut that place down. So he looked at me very suspiciously initially. And after I told him that I was writing for Newsday and I thought I would like to write about their lives in this camp, he even thought that was even stranger, that someone would write about them. I mean, they never had any attention. The last time any reporters out here paid any attention to these camps was in 1956, I think, when Edward R. Murrow did a CBS show called Harvest of Shame, in which he went up the East Coast following these camps and had a scene at that Cox Lane camp I mentioned earlier. So the people in the Depot Lane camp were puzzled by, what are you doing here? What do you want to do? And I just kept going back and talking to them and ended up writing a whole bunch of stories for Newsday about them. And as I said before, I really became very attached to them, particularly after the fire and they had nowhere to go. Yeah. One of them, B. Smith, ended up in an apartment in Riverhead where she was murdered. Oliver had no idea how to get back to Georgia. I found his mother by just making about 1,000 phone calls.
I was going to say, Can we talk about
Sure.
Oliver Burke? I mean, reading the book, because these people experience so much hardship. And it was very emotional reading about Oliver Burke reuniting with his mother. And I was just, you said you made like 1,000 phone calls. How did you even, was he the one who didn't have his birth certificate or was looking
He was the one. Oliver came up to me one day after I started being just nosy and going in and out of that camp and talking to people and asking a million questions and driving them all crazy. He said to me, well, you seem like a smart guy. Can you find my birth certificate? And I said, you don't have a birth certificate? I never knew anybody didn't have a birth certificate. And he said he was born in Georgia. So I began letter writing to the archives and health department in Georgia, could never find his birth certificate. But he started giving me a little bit of clues. Like he said, well, my mother is named Ida May, and he thought she may have had a married last name. And I just kept calling people. And then one night before I left the Newsday newsroom, kind of out of desperation, I called the sheriff's department in that county that he thought he was born in. And a dispatcher answered the phone, a woman. And I told her, look, I'm on a wild goose chase. I'm trying to find the family of this man. And she said, well, that's kind of crazy. But she said, we have sheriff's deputies go all over the county, down every dirt road, and we know who lives in which shacks. And several weeks went by, and she called me and said, I think I might have found something. And that ended up leading me to his mother, who was still alive. Ida May was her name, Ida May Hammock. And I called her one day at the office at Newsday and said, are you Ida May? And she said, yes. I said, do you have a son named Oliver Burke? And she said, yes. And she said she gave him up when he was just 2 weeks old to her cousin and husband, who were going to New Jersey to pick blueberries on a camp. And I said, well, your son is alive. He's living in a camp on the North Fork of Long Island. And she just broke down. She said, I don't have any means of getting there or getting him home. I said, don't worry, I'll bring him back. And so he saw his mother for the first time since he was 2 weeks old. And they lived together in Georgia until she died a few years ago. And then the other one was Frank, which is a whole other story.
Yeah.
And Frank was the most lost person I think I've ever met in my life. I didn't think anybody could be that disconnected from reality. He had been in camps since he was probably a teenager. I found out later that he was born in McClellanville, South Carolina, that he didn't get along with his father, and he left to live with a friend, could have even been a cousin, in Manhattan. And he ended up in Harlem, drunk, passed out outside of a bar somewhere. And one of these crew chiefs, this is the way they pick people up, put him in a bus and brought him to a labor camp on what was then Route 58 in Riverhead. And that began this long ordeal of being poor and Black and living in squalid camps until he ended up in this camp, this last camp. And as I was making some progress with Oliver, and it was clear to me, Emma, that this camp was going to close. I mean, they only had 3 farmers who were bringing their potatoes there to be graded when they once had hundreds of trucks would line up during potato season just to get their potatoes bagged. It was down to the wire. And meanwhile, these places were being bought up by the vineyards. So I kept, every time I was there, I said to Frank, do you know anything? Do you have any clue? What's your last name? He said his last name was Frank Singleton. What state were you born in? He didn't know. How old are you? He didn't know. I wrote a lot of letters to different states looking for a Frank Singleton who might be 60 or 65. And I didn't make any progress. And then one day there was a little garden by the barn that Jimmy Wilson maintained. He had a little farm stand. And I went there late one afternoon when Jimmy and Frank were putting some tomatoes in baskets for the farm stand. And I said, Frank, this is ridiculous. You got to know something. And he said, I went to the Lincoln School. And I went, Lincoln School? What state is the Lincoln School in? He didn't know. It was the only clue he ever gave me. And I thought, wow, what else? So I began, as you might imagine, there were more than a few Lincoln schools in the South. But in this McClellanville, South Carolina area, there was not only a Lincoln school, but there was a cluster of Black Singletons. And that took probably 3 or 4 months to find. So I began calling some of those Singletons. And one day before I left the office at Newsday, I connected with an older man named Mr. Singleton in McClellanville, told him that I was writing for Newsday and that I was writing about this camp where this man, Frank Singleton, lived. And I wanted to find out where he was from. And he wasn't particularly friendly on the phone. He just basically said, I don't have any time for this, but give me your phone number. So I gave him my phone number. A couple of weeks went by, Emma, and he called me. And he said, listen, I really want to apologize. My wife just died. I'm really lost. Tell me again what you want to do. I said, I'm looking for a Frank Singleton who may or may not have been born in McClellanville, South Carolina. He said, I'll get back to you. I don't know how much time went by, certainly a month. And he called back. He said, I think I may have found your guy. And I said, oh, what did you find? He said, well, in the mid-'60s, a man named Frank Snyder disappeared from here, and the family's never seen him again. And I said, Mr. Singleton, I can't start this all over again. I'm looking for Frank Singleton. I'm not looking for Frank Snyder. And he said, I think you need to call these people. And he gave me their phone number. Called the number, and a woman answered the phone. And I told her who I was, and she said, God, we've been hearing for weeks and weeks about someone from New York calling all over the place looking for Frank Singleton. She said, I think you found my brother. And I said, I didn't find your brother. I found it. This is a Frank Singleton. And she said, well, does he have kind of a bad eye? And I said, yeah, it's kind of milky. Does he have a bad limp? And I said, oh, he's a terrible limp. He kind of drags his right leg behind him. She said, that's my brother. I wasn't convinced, so I had Viorel Florescu, our photographer, print out some photos of Frank from the camp, and I overnight mailed them to her. And she called back the next day and said, "That's my brother." He had no means of going anywhere. He had no money. I mean, after what, 30 some years in farm labor camps, he didn't have a penny to his name. All the clothes he had were just donated clothes people would drop off in garbage bags or something. And he had no means to get on a plane or a train or a bus even. So VRL and I and another photographer rented a van. And one Saturday night, we went up Depot Lane and picked him up. And he said goodbye to everyone at the camp. And we drove overnight to McClellanville, South Carolina. We arrived there on a Sunday morning. And the house he grew up in was just basically a shack behind what looked like an old plantation. And I could hear a very elderly woman, it turned out to be his mother, calling out, "My son's home, my son's home." And I later went in the house and met her. She was in her mid-90s then. And honestly, Emma, it kind of reminded me of the end of slavery, when people would be looking for their family that got sold off. And someone maybe sold from Virginia to Georgia somehow found his way home. And she kept crying as we were getting Frank out of the car because he was pretty much handicapped. "My son's home, my son's home." And then his sister ran out, and then his brother ran out. And again, they hadn't seen him for 35 years or more, certainly 30. And it was Frank. And I don't know that he much remembered where he was from, but it was him. We took him inside. And that was a Sunday morning. And down a dirt road from their house was a little Baptist church. And it absolutely emptied out. Everybody came to the house to see this returning man. And again, I was sitting there in the house watching this reunion. I thought, my God, this is 1865. What's changed? I mean, slavery's over, but de jure slavery is over. De facto slavery goes on. And it went on in his life. All those years he worked, he had absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. And just clothes that were just dropped off or he got at the Salvation Army place in Riverhead. And we stayed with him for a few days. VRL and I did, took a lot of pictures for Newsday. And I met his mother, who was in her mid-90s. And they were just so relieved to have this man back. But it was as emotional a place as I've ever seen.
Yeah, I can't even imagine that sort of reunion with a family member who's been gone so long, and like the odds of him finding his way back were wildly slim.
And once that barn burned down and the camp was shuttered, what would have become of him?
Did people just because I believe it was B or
B.
There was another woman, Clara. When the farm was closed, or perhaps it was when the barn burned down. You wrote in the book that the last anyone saw of her, she was walking to the bus stop, and she said she was going to live with her mother.
That was Clara, and she had a mother in Riverside, which is that little neighborhood across from downtown Riverhead. And I didn't see her again until Marielle and I were talking about this book in the Bridgehampton Library, and there she was.
No way, really?
I had not seen her in the whole time since the early 2000s.
Wow.
And after the book came out, Marielle and I were talking about it. And Clara came to the Bridgehampton Library. And there she was.
Oh, my God.
It was just unbelievable.
Yeah.
And she was a fascinating woman. There were two women in there most of the time, B. Smith and Clara. And B was wonderfully helpful. B tried in her own way to try to find homes for these people because everyone knew this place was going to close. I think the fire coming along forced it. I always thought that was kind of odd, the timing of that fire, but nonetheless it was ruled an accident. It was a terribly old barn. And Clara just resented the way people were treated. I mean, she was very bitter about it. B understood her own life as being she grew up in a farm labor camp in Bridgehampton where her mother brought her. And here she was, this camp's closing. And she's the one that ended up in an apartment in Riverhead where a guy came in and killed her. And Clara ended up with her mother. And I think the mother's now long dead. But, I can't overstate the fact that these people's lives, particularly Frank, when I was with him and his family in South Carolina, and you're hearing my son's home, my son's home, it just feels like history is this wheel that never stops turning, that we're always seem to be coming back to the same place.
Yeah.
We didn't solve any of these issues. And what I think annoyed me the most, Emma, was that farmers here depended on these camps, particularly the Cox Lane camp, Black people from Arkansas, and then the Depot Lane camp. They depended for their livelihoods on their potato farms. And that meant you need labor to put them in bags so they could sell them in the market. Yet they didn't care or seem to care at all about the conditions in the camp. I never knew a farmer even went in the camp, let alone an official government person who might have checked to see why Frank had never been paid. So to me, writing about this was not just a way to in effect kind of celebrate the work they did here, but it was the fact to honor the fact, and no one had done this before, that without these people, there was no potato farms here. All this open space was once potato farms.
There's a lot of, maybe not a lot of, but I feel like we have sometimes a very romanticized idea of farming on the North Fork. Obviously, it is a big part of the heritage around here on the east end of Long Island. But I do think there is, a romanticized version of that. We don't, and even probably now, I don't know much about migrant farming in whatever form it exists today on Long Island. I'm sure that there is still exploitation of laborers happening. I was curious as to whether or not you reported on that or have seen any reporting on it more recently.
The idea of labor camps is long since over. They couldn't be sustained. They would pack them in these camps. The camps were, by and large, horrible places to live in. Just me going in and out of the camp on Depot Lane, I would go back into, there was a little bunk room in the back where they all slept. And I thought, my God, this place is just unreal. There's a photograph in the book, All That Remains, of Frank's bedroom.
Yeah. That's
his bedroom. I mean, I don't know anybody who would live in that room. And yet he lived in that room. And we have to acknowledge this. The current situation is much more Latino farm workers and people who, they have houses that most certainly they're cramped in lots of houses. And hopefully the town is on top of that. Because if you had a fire with some in those houses, you'd lose a lot of lives. But it's a different economy now. There's a different conditions now. I don't think they would tolerate in any way what was once here, but they tolerated it then, which still baffles me. And I don't think anywhere in rural America, any farm, pig farms, cattle ranches, anything could survive without Latino farm workers. They are the backbone of rural America.
Yeah.
And now that's very controversial.
I understand for some people that's controversial. I think that if you look at the numbers, that is just the reality.
The reality is you're not going to have a chicken farm with 10,000 chickens or 10,000 pigs in rural Iowa if you don't have these people doing the work.
Yeah.
So if we reach a point in our country where we don't want these people anymore, the economic impact is going to be severe. But I think for me, putting all that aside, I think for me, Emma, the whole point of that camp and writing about it was to correct an historical wrong. It's like we live in a place where before the English ever arrived in supposedly 1640, although I think that date is questionable, there were people living here for thousands of years. And yet town histories didn't really go into this at all, or they romanticized the Indian, kind of the last of the Mohicans.
Yeah.
That's not what happened here.
Yeah.
The native people were on this land. And what's astonishing to me is part of the Wickham farm right over here. And Tom Wickham, if you have him on the show, he can tell you the story. When the English arrived in 1640, they found that this part of Cutchogue they called the Broadfields, because over thousands of years it had been cleared of trees for farming. Part of the Wickham farm is on that Broadfields. So on that farm, Emma, think about this for a second. You have a place where for 10,000 years, people grew food, and they're still growing food on it.
Mm.
That's how rich this place is. So not to acknowledge the Black people living in these camps, whom people basically disregarded, not to acknowledge their place in the history of this place is just wrong. And all that's being corrected. I mean, Mark McNish has a slavery exhibit in the old house. I give him huge credit for that. Mariella here in the library has just gone out of her way to tell a better story. Amy Folk, the town historian, has gone way out of her way. The first really in town historians to try to tell a more complete story.
Yeah.
And it's so important. If you're never going to figure out the present if you're not honest about the past.
No, absolutely. And it's a truer story. I think that, I mean, history is in some ways a story that we tell. There are the facts of history, but obviously we didn't live it. So really what you select to talk about is what shapes, I think, our understanding of the present. And it is truer and honoring people of the past in preserving and telling their stories, especially people who are so marginalized and so exploited during their lifetimes.
Yeah. There's no other way to look at it. I would talk to the people up there all the time, particularly Mr. Wilson, and he's a really sad story, and I'll get into that in a second. But they didn't think they could go anywhere in Southold. I said, "Do you ever go to the beach?" And they looked at me like I was crazy. John Wickham, Tom Wickham's father, who died in the 90s, ran into Mr. Wilson somewhere and said, "Hey, you can go fishing behind my house in Wickham Creek anytime you want. Just drive your truck down there. You're welcome to use the creek." So he was welcome there. But Jimmy told me several times he didn't know where else he could go. He somehow had this thing build up from growing up in rural Georgia that he couldn't go where white people lived. And when we got down at the end and I had taken Frank home and I had taken Oliver back to Georgia, and it was really down, and Clara had left and Bee had left before she was killed. It was Mr. Wilson. He's basically living in a pickup truck. And I kept telling him, I will be glad. He knew he was born in Barwick, Georgia, but he left there when he was maybe 5 or 6 and when his mother died. And I kept saying, Jimmy, this place is, you're done here. 80 years of farm labor camps in the North Fork, it's over. I'll take you back to Barwick, Georgia. And he was in his 80s. And I said, you can end up your life there. And he said, I'll never go back there. And he was so adamant about it that I didn't think I could change his mind. But I bought a ticket to go down there to do my own research in Barwick. And I called thinking I could maybe trick him into going. I said, "Oh, I have a ticket. I'm going to go to Georgia. You want to come with me?" Thinking, "Oh, okay, you're so insistent, I'll go with you." But he said, "I will never in a million years ever go back to that place." So I went down there. It took 2 or 3 trips to Barwick and did some research. And I discovered that going through the library in Thomasville, which is the bigger town near Barwick, Barwick's like 80 people or something, I found some newspaper clips from November of 1920. So Jimmy would have been 2 years old. He was born in 1918. And in November of 1920, a Barwick black man named Ralph Wilson, was grabbed by a white mob because they said he had gone into a white person's house. And they were going to lynch him when some sheriff's deputies pulled him out of the crowd. They had to drive him to another county to save him from being lynched. And he was put on trial in Thomasville, Georgia. And amazingly, he was acquitted after 5 or 6 minutes. And I'm reading these clips and I'm thinking, wow, a black man named Wilson from Barwick, Georgia? So I called up Jimmy when he was still in the camp, and he had a phone in the camp. And I said, "Jimmy, I'm in Barwick. And who's Ralph Wilson?" And he said, I don't know who Ralph Wilson was. I said, "Mr. Wilson, we got about 80 people living in Barwick. Who's Ralph Wilson? Was this your father?" And he said, "I don't know anything about it. And don't ask me again about him." And then the next time I called him thinking I could trick him into going. And I went down there and I said, I'm going anyway. And he said, would you do me a favor? I said, sure. He said, would you put flowers on my mother's grave if you can find it? Now, this was a Black woman who died in 1925. And even death was segregated in rural Georgia. And I said, Mr. Wilson, I don't understand this. You want me to go to Georgia to put flowers on your mother's grave when I could take you there and you could do it yourself? And he said, I can't go there. I've told you this 100 times. I'm not going. And I think the not going was the fact that within his family, he's 2 years old. There's obviously a family member, Ralph, who's nearly murdered by a mob. There were hundreds of other lynchings. I think there were 2,000 in the Deep South. There were hundreds in the very county he grew up in. So the violence all around them and the contempt and the disrespect. And they had a labor camp system there where if a Black man was picked up for, say, loitering and he couldn't pay the fine, the judge could put you in a camp to work it off. And these camps were terrible. They were turpentine camps, actually. So I said, look, I'd like you to go with me. And he said, I'm not going. So I went down there and I had a local researcher in Barwick help me find what was pretty much an abandoned cemetery behind a Black Baptist church. And I talked to enough people and I realized that his mother, Ada Wilson, was buried there in 1925 when Jimmy would have been 5 or 6. And standing in that graveyard, I tried to picture what it was like for him. This horrible situation they're all in. They got white people all around them, they hate them and want to kill them. And here his mother's dead and he's 6 years old, 5 or 6 years old. His grandmother, his mother's mother, was Julia Wilson, who was born in 1867, 2 years after the passage of the 13th Amendment ending slavery, said, we got to get out of here. So she took him across the border into northern Florida to live where her brother was living. His name was Richard Bradley, and I found out he was born a slave in the 1850s, I think. And Jimmy was there from about age 6 to about 14. And there was another horrific lynching, which I think I talk about in the book, in northern Florida. And for whatever reason, just the hatred, the lack of any opportunities. He couldn't even go to a school because the Black school had no books or desks or anything. One day, a truck came into the town he was living in Florida. And a Black man, a crew chief, said to people who gathered around the truck, I'm going to North Jersey, Red Bank, New Jersey. This was 1933, 1934. It's a potato farm, and there'll be wonderful places to live and 3 meals a day, and you get paid every Friday. And this 13 or 14-year-old boy, I mean, just picture this happening to him. This 13 or 14-year-old boy climbed up in the back of that truck with 6 or 8 other people. And over 2 days, they drove to northern New Jersey. He spent the next about 15 years in that camp in Red Bank. Then he was in a camp in Port Jefferson, which once had a lot of potato grading facilities on the railroad tracks. Then he was in Calverton, and then he was here again in this last camp. So this history that he would never return to was the fact that growing up in rural Georgia and Florida in the 1920s and early 1930s was just horrific. And yet he was here in Cutchogue, and he was the grandson of a slave here in Cutchogue. In the early 2000s, we had a man here who was the grandson of an enslaved man named Richard Bradley. And he could have been an incredible resource if anybody bothered to pay attention to him.
And I think also it's just always shocking to me to hear at least I think about slavery as being so far in the deep past. Like the American institution of slavery was not so long ago. It's only a couple of generations removed. And also not only Jimmy Wilson's, it was his grandparent who was enslaved.
His grandfather.
It wasn't just that. Was he living through the Jim Crow era of the South?
He knew the name of his father. His name was Barry Wilson. I could never find a death certificate for him. But he and his parents, Barry Wilson and Julia, were born, and Ada Wilson, his mother, were born in the 1880s, right in the height of violent Jim Crow, when there were hundreds and hundreds of lynchings. And if you read about these lynchings, Emma, you really can't fathom how white people could behave like this. Hundreds of people used to go to these lynchings. Word would spread, we're going to lynch a man. And they would all come, and it would almost turn into a picnic. They would take photographs.
It's like medieval. And one of the things you mentioned in the book was that there was this horrible lynching of this man in Florida whose last name was Neil. It was so shocking to read the newspaper headline: "Thousands thronged to see Florida mob murder Negro, countryside invited to Negro's lynching."
And they took photographs, and you know what they would do with the photographs? They would make postcards out of them, and they would sell the postcards of someone hanging from a tree. And that man was brutally tortured, ripped to pieces. Then they set his body on fire. So what I'm saying is that we had this man living here in Cutchogue who was a living embodiment of a period of our history in the South, as well as being the grandson of an enslaved man, right here in our town. And nobody knew any of this. And when you don't listen to people, when you don't care about the other people around, when you think history is your story, but nobody else's story, this is what you get. It's not a surprise that history can be so incomplete, but to our great credit, and I credit the Cutchogue Library for publishing this book. That was just wonderful. Jan Nicholson, Side by Side Foundation, paid for it. Whether it's Mark McNish or Mariella here or Amy Folk in the town historian's office, beginning to realize that, no, there's more to this. And that's why this book, I think, is really, really important. And I'm very grateful to the library for this, because it tells a more complete story. But one day I would like one of the old farmers to tell me, you made money off these people. You didn't care about how they lived? No.
I wanted to ask also, maybe this is a bit of like a journalism question, but did you bump up against, like, I guess, ethical concerns for yourself as you're like talking to people and reporting on like their lives and the most intimate parts of their lives?
Yeah, that's really a really good point. And the standard rule in journalism is that you're there to observe. You're there not to take sides. You're there not to get involved. I blew all that up on this stuff. I threw all that out the window. There was no way I was going to ignore these people or pretend that the camp didn't burn down and they're living in parked cars. And I wrote all those stories for Newsday, and the Newsday editors, made comments about, the story itself. And I explained what I was doing. And the stories won 1 million prizes. But it definitely kind of broke the idea that, no, you're just a reporter. You're on the sidelines. You're just observing. I became very attached to them. I wanted to know where they were from. I ended up driving 2 of them home, which is not something a journalist normally does. You don't normally find people's houses and then drive them home. But I couldn't do otherwise. And I think to this day, I think it was some of the best stuff I've ever done as a journalist. And journalism in a free society, in a democratic society, really needs to function well. We need to know what's going on around us. And that's how I felt about that camp.
And I guess that kind of leads into one of my questions as well, which is, as neighbors, as residents on the North Fork, I think a lot of people pride themselves on having this like small town community, and I too, I feel that way. I like waving to my neighbors when I see people. I like knowing people's names. As neighbors, if there are people around us who are being exploited, or how can we be good neighbors, or even just how people can be more aware?
Well, the New York Times, I forget when it was, it may have been 1 or 2 months ago, maybe 2.5 months ago, did a really incredible piece about a Latino homeless camp in the woods in Southampton. You may have seen it.
I believe.
And one of them died.
Yeah.
And I think that piece, to me, was really a declaration of, look, these people are now living in the woods in makeshift camps. That was a really important piece. But I think more than anything, in a democratic society, if you look at the New England town meeting model, and this being once a very serious part of New England, we all just have to pay attention. And we need newspapers to inform us what's going on so that we can have opinions about what's going on. I never heard any criticism of these stories when they ran in Newsday, and then later in the book. We had a big gathering here when the book came out. The place was absolutely packed. And I think people, particularly those people who grew up here, Emma, understood what the situation was, that this camp was here. There were other camps here, and they didn't know these people. But now finally we have an account of their lives. But I think a democratic society really requires us to care, whether you care about your next door neighbor or you care about how the town functions. We need to make sure our voices are heard in a good way, in a polite way, but in a serious way. Otherwise, we're just going to lose control of it. But to me, and I really want to repeat this, the library publishing this book and Jan Nicholson paying for it saved a piece of our history that had long been ignored and neglected. And thus, their lives, whether it's Frank or Oliver or Bea or Clara or Jimmy, we now know who they were. They now can live past their time. And someone 10 years from now can read this and go, oh, this used to be out here. And we're now a very different kind of place. I mean, we now have billionaires living among us, and all for the well and good. But you still need to know the history of the place you're living in. Yeah. And this helps.
I was curious if you're still in touch with any of the people or their families, or if that's like a journalistic thing. You don't stay in touch with people.
No, I stayed in touch with all of them. Jimmy died soon after I came back. After I did go to Georgia, Barwick, and I did find out where his mother was buried. And I did put flowers on the grave. I came back and told him that, and he died soon thereafter. His truck actually, I think he was in Mattituck somewhere, and he died. The only one other than Clara, who I did meet at the Bridgehampton Library, the only one in that group that I still talk to is Oliver. I took him home, and he was with his mother, Ida Mae. I think she died maybe 10 years after I brought him home. And again, it doesn't even make sense that these people got home. I mean, when you just look at, what are you spending 10,000 phone calls to try to find some disappeared person's life? But thank God we did find them. And Ida Mae told me her story growing up in rural Georgia, and she didn't want her black son growing up there, and she gave him away to a family going to New Jersey to pick blueberries. But she was a wonderful person, and she got to be with her son. And that night that I called her, when I said, I have your son, he's living in a work camp up here. And after she stopped crying, she said she had found a little baby photograph, and she put it next to her bed just a couple of weeks before I called. So, some stories work out.
Yeah.
That one worked out.
Yeah. Steve, thank you so much again for coming in today and talking about this and sharing the stories of these folks. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
I really, really appreciate it. If anyone wants to check out the book, we have copies available at the Cutchogue Library. There's another book that you mentioned in All That Remains that I started reading after the fact called Long Island Migrant Labor Camps, Dust for Blood.
Yeah, Mark Torres's book. Yeah.
And I started reading that, and I would definitely recommend it also as a book if anyone's interested in this history.
In the subject.
Yeah, it's a good companion, I guess.
Yes, it's a very good companion piece. Mark did a really good job on it. So that's where we are. And, getting history right, Emma, it really matters. And the more we do to get it right, to tell more complete stories, the better off we'll be today.
Steve, thanks so much again.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today on For Your Information, the Cutchogue New Suffolk Free Library podcast. I hope you tune in again soon, and I hope you learned something new. For Your Information is a production of the Cutchogue New Suffolk Free Library. Our intro and outro music is Lavender Sky by Kaizan Blue. I'm your host, producer, editor, and emerging technologies librarian, Emma Layden. We'll catch you next time. Until then, stay open to new ideas.